George Berkeley is famous for several important innovations in philosophy. An Anglican bishop born around the time of the Glorious Revolution in England. He lived about 70 years. He was one of the earliest and, I believe, most profound critics of the Enlightenment. In a sense, he can be seen as the first romantic thinker, the first person to react against what was seen by some thinkers as the stultifying hyper-rationalism of the Enlightenment. He's an extremely famous thinker. He once said something like, "The future of civilization lies in the West," and people out near San Francisco felt very highly about that, so named a college after him. He's also the figure around whom the question arose, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? And we will answer that question. He was also most famously refuted by Samuel Johnson thus. And again, we will see how that's not a very strong refutation of Berkeley at all. What Berkeley opposed about the Enlightenment was its rising metaphysic of mechanistic materialism. And we've discussed some of that in previous lectures. Professor Coors on Locke, the Newtonian revolution, Descartes, Spinoza. In all of these cases, we found in the West, from the Age of Reason to the Age of Enlightenment, a growing sense of enthusiasm about breakthroughs in particularly the field of mechanics after the writings of Newton. And mechanistic materialism is the metaphysical view that the world is made of material entities that interact in a purely mechanical fashion, as we would find in Newtonian physics. And moreover, that the only place that God could have in such a system would be a first creator. The famous metaphor of the time was that the universe and the world was like a big clock. And if there was a God, he was the clockmaker. But once he wound the clock up, as it were, and let it go, there was no room for God anymore. The machine moved of its own laws. And that is, of course, mechanistic materialism. I want to give you, on the one hand, a sense of the excitement that 18th century figures had, because for the first time they could argue, we've made an innovation and a breakthrough in our understanding of the universe that no previous culture has. For once, we've gone far beyond anything the classic Greeks could have offered, or that Aristotle could ever have suggested. So there's a tremendous sense of power and pride in this wonderful accomplishment. But on the other hand, there were those who reacted against it. And Berkeley's the first, later we'll find Rousseau, and the entire Romantic movement. Because that view leads, so it is thought, towards skepticism. And not only towards skepticism, but towards atheism. Towards the view that, well, gee, if God is only really the watchmaker, and the watch runs on its own, maybe there was no watchmaker, maybe there's just the watch. And that's the bottom line. And it was that which Berkeley reacted against. Nonetheless, Berkeley did share in what was, by the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the epistemological view of the materialists, which is empiricism. Professor Coors, I think, has quite admirably described the Lockean empiricist phenomenology, the view that the human mind is nothing but a tabula rasa, a blank slate, whose datum and information, ideas, all arise from sense experience. Right? So this is blank slate, we take in datum through our five senses, and from that arise all of our conceptions, ideas, and images of the world. Not only did Berkeley share this empiricist epistemology, phenomenology, in fact, I would urge Berkeley was far more adept at what philosophers call deploying the empiricist phenomenology than Locke ever was. And I want to give you one example of that. That's from the treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge. That is Berkeley's discussion of Locke's doctrine of abstract ideas. It's not incredibly important that you get the doctrine of the critique of abstract ideas so much as you get a sense of the form of the argument, the sort of incredible logical precision that this Anglican bishop brought into his philosophic researches. Now, first of all, what are abstract ideas for Locke? Locke, as an empiricist, naturally was critical of what was, throughout the scholastic period, known as the realist tradition. Realism has to do with the problem of universals. We have some words that seem to refer to a multitude of objects, or seem to refer to no particular object. Words like humanity, right, or man in general, or triangularity. Such words are universals. They apply to more than one particular case. The contrast are particular terms like Darren Staloff, right, which refers only to myself. Now, the realist way of interpreting such things is to say that such universal terms refer to real objects. So somewhere out there, perhaps in the metaphysical realm, is the real universal man, the real universal humanity, the real essence of triangularity. Now, Locke is an empiricist, a member of the Anglo-American tradition enough so that he's critical of that. And he argues no. In fact, there is no external real triangularity. There is no external real man or humanity. Rather, those things are abstract concepts which exist only in the mind. And he thought that this was a very good way of attacking the realist position and arguing that such universals really are only nominal essences. They're essences only in name. And in fact, they're not subsistent entities in the world, but simply abstract ideas in our mind. Well, Berkeley will have none of that. Berkeley's empiricism is far more thoroughgoing, as is his nominalism. Now, nominalism is the third great position in the realist debate. And I should point out, realism is still a contemporary debate, primarily with respect to mathematical entities and foundational researches in mathematics. The nominalist position that Berkeley takes is the view that universals are universal only in name. In other words, there is no object referred to by the word man or mankind. It is simply a summatory way of talking about the sum or set of all men or people. So triangularity doesn't refer to an essence called triangularity. It simply refers to every particular triangle you come across. Humanity refers to each of the people in this room and all of the other featherless bipeds we find around the planet. Similarly, justice does not refer to some essence. There's no definition of justice. It simply is a way of, in a rough way, of talking about the sum of all just acts. There is nothing in the world but particulars, and hence the expression nominalism. Universals are only names. They do not refer to things, or if they do refer, they refer to the set of all particular things that one can apply that name to. So then what Berkeley concludes is that abstract ideas are in fact a logical impossibility. The only ideas we can have are particular. And he has two very strong arguments for this doctrine. First of all, accepting the Lockean empiricist epistemology, all of our ideas arise either directly or indirectly from our impressions or sense datum. And all of our ideas are obviously copies of those sense datum. So, you observe me pacing about this podium, you close your eyes and think of the idea of me, and you get a mental image of me, which is more or less a copy of what your senses supplied. Fair enough. Then he says, well, you'll note something. Each of your sense datum, right, are particular. You see particular patterns of colors, you hear particular ranges of sounds, particular tactile experiences, particular odors, tastes. Nothing general in your sense datum. If that's so, then how could you possibly have an abstract idea? You never have an abstract sense impression, and if ideas are copies of sense datum, then it is a logical impossibility to have an abstract idea. And then he has a second argument. Ideas are obviously mental representations or images. Again, think of your idea of me, close your eyes and do the great thought experiment phenomenologically, and you get an image of me, a picture in your, as it were, mind's eye. So he says, then let us take a look at how we would create, say, an abstract image of humanity. So I want you all to try and create this image. Create an image of a human, but it can't be male or female. Right? So you have a genderless image. Next, add its other features. It can neither be tall nor short, right? Can't be one color or another. Can't be black or white or red or yellow. Can neither have hair or not have hair. Can't be fat or thin, right? Can't be well-proportioned or ill-proportioned. Can't be ugly or beautiful. You got that image in your mind? Right? And Berkeley says, if you have that image in your mind, I know a good doctor you should see. He says, so clearly we don't have abstract ideas. That's a piece of superstition. We can never create such an image. Okay. And again, I don't want you to think that the doctrine of the critique of abstract ideas is in itself important. We will see that in the 20th century, many important thinkers, Quine among them, accepts the nominalist interpretation of mathematical entities. But rather I want you to see the technique of argumentation, how the argument of empiricism and tabula rasa works itself out before we come to what is the most famous and difficult doctrine that Berkeley has. And that is that he argues if you take empiricism seriously and you're logically consistent in your interpretation, you cannot escape the conclusion that the only phenomena of which you are aware are ideas in your mind. And if that is the case, that the metaphysical doctrine of materialism is nothing but a base superstition, and that the very notion of matter is nothing other than a sort of occult substratum, which has no logical or empirical basis. And that's a position that's known as absolute idealism. It's a very bizarre metaphysical doctrine, but it has a kernel of truth and will become extremely important in the 19th century tradition, especially with absolute idealists like Hegel, Fichte, Herder, and others. I expose it to you first with Berkeley because I think from an empiricist angle, it's much simpler to get a sense of exactly how it might be, in some sense at least, plausible. Well, we begin with the observation that all of the sensible objects of which we are aware are comprised of ideas derived from sense. Right? If you think about whatever you had for breakfast, let's say you had an orange, that orange, as you experienced it in your mind, was a series of flavors, odors, colors, and textures, perhaps of the peel and of the meat of the orange, as it were, all conjoined in your experience. So to take an example we can all see, we look at this lecture. All right? What is it made of? It's made of a series of ideas. And ideas in the sense of phenomenological experiences that occur in our minds. We experience a certain range of brown wood-like colors. If you care to come up after the lecture, you can feel that there are smooth grain textures, pretty good until you get to the chipboard on top. A certain range of sounds that could be produced by rapping on it. And a particular range of tastes, if you choose to get very close inspection, perhaps even you could olfactorily inspect it, which is to say sniff it, and a range of odors. You take all those things together, that's all of the datum you have about this lectern, right? Are those particular ideas, which are copies of your sense impressions. That is what this lectern is. Okay, well, there's one thing missing in this lectern, in those experiences. Think about it. You've got the colors, the flavors, the odors, the textures, and the sounds. Where's the matter? And that's where Berkeley makes a sharp criticism. He says, look, materialists want to critique Anglican bishops like myself for being superstitious. Tell me, Mr. Empiricist, what is the flavor of matter? And what color does matter come in? And what does it taste like? What does it smell like, matter? Had you ever actually experienced matter? And you want to criticize religious people for believing in things that go bump in the dark? There's nothing more superstitious than believing that there is something out there which everything is made out of, which none of us has ever experienced. We've never seen it, we've never tasted it, we've never heard it, and we have no idea what it would taste like, sound like, or look like. Okay. So then what is matter? And Berkeley says, well, matter is a posit. We have the various ideas, right, of, again, this lectern, and we say, well, they all reside in one entity. And we say there's a substratum that supports those ideas or those properties, and that substratum we'll call matter. And then Berkeley argues, since you never sense matter, And sensible objects aren't actually unified by the positive matter, are they? They're actually unified by constant conjunction, which is to say, why do you say that the colors and flavors and sounds associated with this lectern make up one thing, a lectern? Because every time you come across this lectern, it has all of those properties. If you came across it tomorrow and it had different colors, you would say different lectern, wouldn't you? So he says it has nothing to do with the material substratum. It's actually just constant conjunction. You always find the same range of sense datum of ideas in your mind associated with the same object. And in fact, the object is nothing but a conglomeration, a conjunction of those various sense datum. So he says if that's the case, then why in heaven's name would we bother to posit matter? And here he does, I think, a very nasty trick against the materialist. He applies something known as Occam's razor. William of Ockham was a great British theologian, also one of the founders of Anglo-American style of philosophy. He was a nominalist. And his nominalism took the form of a principle he called Occam's razor. If you can explain a phenomena or a problem, and one person can explain it with 4 moving parts, and another with 5 moving parts, both explanations are equally adequate and sufficient. Occam's razor says you simply cut off those extra entities. The less moving parts, the better. So if I can explain something with 4 entities and you require 5, my explanation is better. We cut off your 5th entity with Occam's razor, slice it off. And it's an accepted philosophical principle. So he says, now, again, look at the construction of our world. What looks like it's time to get shaved by Occam's razor? It's matter, right? It really has no explanatory function whatsoever. So we apply Occam's razor, and we acknowledge that all of the, quote, sensible objects of the world are nothing but ideas, constantly conjoined in our mind. And we have the exact same world as before. Well, that does raise one issue, however. If all the sensible objects of the world, including lecterns, speakers, watches, are nothing but ideas, ideas themselves must have a substratum. And what could that substratum be? Well, he points out that it can't be matter. It is literally a logical absurdity to say that the various ideas of a lectern reside in its matter. In what sense do ideas reside in matter? In what sense does matter support ideas? And since all we're actually aware of are the ideas, we're not even aware of our sense receptors, right? Those are posited to explain the phenomenological experience that we have. Then matter is obviously not the posit we need. It's not the substratum that'll do the job for us. So what will the substratum be? Well, it's fairly obvious. What holds ideas? Minds. That's our obvious intuitive notion of the mind, or, if you wish, the spirit. So, what then is the case metaphysically? It is the case metaphysically that all of the sensible objects we know in the world, and they are sensible objects, are ideas. And they are ideas in the mind, or in minds. Now, I should point something out. Berkeley extended his critique of materialism beyond what we would call secondary objects. Now, Berkeley points out, if you may remember from the discussion of Newton and in earlier scientific figures, that even Descartes had distinguished between primary and secondary qualities. They'd seen the legitimacy of Berkeley's point. They did point out that you're right, the lectern actually doesn't have any colors in and of itself. Right? The color is something that occurs in your mind. What the lectern actually has is it gives off various frequencies of light, and that creates the phenomena of color for you, similarly with all the other sense datum. And so they're willing to give Berkeley that part of it, but they say there are other things which are primary qualities and which are immaterial things themselves, such as shape, figure, extension, motion. And Berkeley says, oh, really? So you don't actually see shapes, do you? And if you do see shapes, well, then the same critique about seeing colors would apply to shapes. Shapes then would be ideas in your mind. And you don't actually see motion. But if you don't see motion, then how did you have the idea of motion? And if you do see motion, then the same critique that applies to secondary qualities will apply to primary qualities as well. Motion is also something you perceive, and therefore is an idea in your mind. Okay? So there is no escaping this absolute idealism. Again, all of the ideas primary as well as secondary, exist only in our minds. Now, we've got this empiricist absolute idealism. From that, Berkeley then is able to prove, at least to his satisfaction, the existence of God. Right? And precisely because we do note a law-like regularity in our ideas. And so God is that cause. Now, I'm going to run through the proof for you as quickly as I can. All of the objects of the world, we know, are ideas and minds. And only minds are capable of producing ideas, right? It's an absurdity to say that this watch creates ideas in my head. Only a mind produces ideas. And while we do produce many ideas, right? We produce the ideas of our imagination. We think of a golden mountain and create that idea or image in our mind. During reflection, I create the image of perhaps this audience as I try to remember it. Not all of the ideas that occur in my mind are created by myself. I am aware of certain ideas that impinge upon me, and those are the ones we commonly call ideas of sense. Right? I don't open my eyes and say, I hope I find brown wood-like textures right in front of me. No, rather I open my eyes and they just happen to be there, as are the various ocular patterns of the audience. Therefore, there must be another mind out there, which is producing the ideas of sense, which I do not produce. And what do we call such a mind? God, right? That's literally what God is. It's that which creates everything around us. That's what we learned in the Bible. Right? God creates and sustains the world. And Berkeley says that's actually philosophically extremely prescient. Because what that really means is that God is sort of the universal switchboard of ideas. Right? You'll remember the brain in a vat hypothesis of Descartes. Well, in a way, God is that super smart computer. And when I, for instance, pace across the podium, God makes sure that in my mind, I have all the tactile feelings of walking across a podium, all of the ocular changes in my visual representation of moving across a lectern, seeing different persons. And as I speak to someone, God makes sure that if I will to say to someone, how are you, that sound is reproduced, or is produced, in fact, in the mind of the person I want to speak to, and that person responds, and God sends the idea to me. So therefore, what we have, God is the universal switchboard of ideas. All there are minds, or spirits, with ideas, and God makes sure that the ideas from one mind correspond to whatever physical occurrences we would normally believe in, and enable us to communicate. Okay. And in fact, from a purely phenomenological position, we can drop the notion of sense, right? Because what do we really mean by sense except for ideas which we do not cause, and which are distinguished by a phenomenological vivacity, or powerfulness, or clarity, right? And again, this is a fair thought experiment. Look at me, then close your eyes and think of me, and you will see that the first image of looking at me is far clearer. There's far more detail and nuance to it than your representation of that afterwards. In fact, then, you have no evidence to actually suggest you have any sense receptors. All you know is that you have some ideas which are more clear than others, and others which you yourself produce. And Berkeley says that entirely fits with the posit of spirits, or minds, having ideas in the world. Okay, now we can turn to our question of the tree in the forest. So, if a tree falls in the forest, and there's no people there to hear it, does it make a sound? And Berkeley responds, of course it does. We don't hear it, but someone else does. God's omniscient. God is everywhere. It makes a sound because God is there to hear it. And then Berkeley raises the ante. He says, look, if there wasn't God there to hear it, it's true there wouldn't be a sound. There also wouldn't be a forest, a tree, or anything falling. That may seem absurd at first, but he's making an interesting point. Do objects in the world, are sensible particular objects, and this is the larger theme of idealism, which is, I think, been a very powerful influence on subsequent speculation. Does the world come prepackaged in the objects we perceive? Right? Does the world naturally parse itself into lecterns and podiums and humans and watches and pieces of paper? And Berkeley and subsequent idealists, in fact, frankly, most philosophers since, have had to acknowledge, no, it doesn't. We parse the world. It would be just as logical for us to say or just as possible for us to say that, for instance, the real lectern isn't this brown wood-like thing, but this brown wood-like thing plus this podium I'm standing upon. That's the real lectern. And why not parse it that way? Or, this is not the same Darren Staloff you might have seen 2 weeks ago. It's a different Darren Staloff. It changes every time he talks about something different. We see different behaviors, and therefore we posit a different entity. Now, we are so used to our conceptual scheme that seems counterintuitive. But again, think of other cultures, right? What happens when someone goes through coming-of-age rituals? They're given a new name and a new identity. They literally believe the old person died, the boy, or the young girl, and a new person, an adult, a male ready now to hunt, or a woman ready to assume the tasks of motherhood, to replace that person. So, the point is, all of the objects we find in the world don't come naturally parsed into natural kinds for us. They are, in fact, imposed on us. We impose a sort of cookie cutter on experience. And that cookie cutter are our ideas. So instead of saying, looking out at this audience, saying, well, there's really only one person here, and it's a collective subject called the audience, and you're all cells in one larger collective subject, my conceptual scheme, or my idealist program, which again, for Berkeley comes from God, he parses it for us, is that there's rather, instead of that, there are unique individual agents in this room. Right? The audience is in fact made up of a discrete number of individual persons. And that is the idealist intuition. It's extremely abstract, abstruse, difficult. But the more you think of it, there is a certain plausibility to it. Again, just on a physical level, why not say something to the effect of, well, Mr. Staloff is really only that figure that runs from his belt up to the top of his head. And then there's this other thing called Mr. Staloff's legs, which is not a part of Mr. Staloff, but every person sort of has them. Counterintuitive to us, but not necessarily impossible. It's a logical possibility. We could think of the world that way. We don't. Therefore, we're imposing our ideas on the world and organizing it. Now, this raises a question about what do we discover in Newtonian physics? And Berkeley is not anti-scientific. Berkeley, I think, is a profound student of Newtonian physics. What he points out is that Newtonian physics doesn't actually explain anything at all. I mean, think about the form of Newtonian mechanics. All it shows us is a series of formulas about the law-like regularity of the experiences, ideas we're going to get. It's wonderful predictive value, but what does it explain? And in fact, Berkeley is right. Right? When we think of gravity, first of all, we recognize that was a metaphor. Gravity means seriousness and depth. Only since has that metaphor died and started to become literal. But when we talk about, say, laws of gravity, the fact that objects are attracted to other masses at an inverse relation to their distances and on the basis of the magnitudes of their masses, the question arises, well, yes, I've noticed that same thing as well, and that objects at sea level seem to fall 32 feet per second squared. But why do they fall for 32 feet per second squared? What causes that? And Berkeley's right. Newton has no answer. And Newton was quite clear in saying, well, I have no idea what causes it. I just noticed that that's what happens. If you want to know what causes it, you have to open the Bible. God causes gravity. And it was a great mystery. What does cause action at a distance? So Berkeley's deep insight into the philosophy of science from his idealism is the realization that science actually does nothing so much as tell us about the regularity of our ideas. That if we, say, release an object at sea level, we should expect to see it fall at a certain rate. No explanation of why it should fall at that rate. We don't know if there's any gravity rays, gravity particles, or what the mechanism is whatsoever. All we know is that from our experience, from the ideas that occur in our minds, we know every time we have the idea of this watch released at sea level, it never falls up, but rather only falls down. Okay. That's not to insult Newtonian science. All right. Berkeley's quite clear. Newtonian physics is of inestimable value. We want to be able to predict future events on the basis of past ones. And that way we can manipulate those future events in a certain way. Right? But that don't distinguish predictive value, this sort of Baconian notion of science as a tool with explanatory value. It doesn't, in fact, explain anything. It simply shows us what we can expect given certain sets of initial conditions. The upshot of this is that Newtonian science has no metaphysical implications. Those people who want to say, well, you've got Newtonian science, therefore materialism is the case, God is dead, whatever. Berkeley says that's nonsense. Newtonian science is wonderful, but all it gives you is a mathematical law for predicting future experiences on the basis of past ones. It doesn't tell you that there's any such thing as matter. Newtonian physics is just as sensible from an idealist worldview as it is from a materialist one. In fact, perhaps more sensible. Okay, so what Berkeley has offered us so far is the fact that if we believe in idealism, no paradoxes ensue, we don't have to give up Newtonian science, we don't have to give up common sense objects. It preserves, as it were, all of the appearances. What are its advantages? Well, he says the belief in matter is fundamentally the cause of skepticism. Why is that so? Think about it. From Descartes on, we have between the material or physical world and ourselves an intervening veil of ideas, of mental representations in our mind. We are only in fact, everyone agrees with Berkeley, only in fact aware, phenomenologically, of those ideas, of those representations, of that, what I've called, show between your ears. Skepticism enters in the question of, how do we ever know that those representations, that stuff that's going on between your ears right now, actually corresponds to material phenomena outside of your mind? And in fact, there's no way to answer that question. You can't know. Any probabilistic arguments you have never get outside of your mind. That's the cause of skepticism. And Berkeley's answer is, well, skepticism is very easily dismissed then, isn't it? You just get rid of the material entities. Right? If all you have are ideas in the mind, then there is no veil. There's no veil of appearances to get beyond. The appearances are, in fact, the world. And Berkeley's deep point is that that may seem counterintuitive only because you've read too much philosophy. Meet the average person, and that's actually what he believes. Right? If you said to the actual person, do you see the actual lectern up here, or do you simply see the material effect of it in your mind? There's no question the actual person would say the former. I don't see phenomenal properties in my mind which are in fact the result of something which has no color, has no sound, has no texture. Just the opposite. What I see is actually a series of colors, textures, sounds. That's the real world, and that's what Berkeley says is the real world. In fact, that's his reaction against the Enlightenment. He wants to be the partisan of common sense, of the common man. And his very sophisticated and abstruse metaphysic of idealism, he believes is actually commonsensical. That's what the average person in the street really believed all along. And those people who don't believe that have just wasted their time reading too many books full of obfuscation. Well, not only is materialism the cause of skepticism, it is more powerfully the cause of atheism. By positing an unknowable and occult substratum, matter, which causes the experience and regularities of the world, we note something. The only reason you would posit that has no explanatory value, violates the principle of Occam's razor, it only has one thing going for it. You're elbowing God out of the picture. And he says that's the only reason anyone ever posited matter was as a way of replacing God's agency in the world. And Berkeley is, as an Anglican bishop, upset at the rise of atheism in the 18th century, of free thinking, of loose morals. And he says, you want to know how to stop this? Get rid of its cause, materialism. Once you get rid of materialism, what causes every idea in your head? Except for the ones that you yourself create in reflection and memory. God. God becomes an immediate presence in the world. We feel his power constantly. It's not some abstract sky father at all. It's the sustaining energy of the universe. And in fact, he says, if you think about Newtonian science from an idealist perspective, it's the ultimate proof of God's existence, isn't it? I suppose he would say it's just a coincidence that the various ways matter interrelate to one another are describable in terms of the integral calculus. Right? Matter of itself would organize itself according to extremely abstruse mathematical laws. He says, of course not. That's the sign of an intelligence. I mean, when you find physical phenomena are describable in terms of, say, the Mandelbrot set, or fractal geometry. That's hardly the basis for believing it's just at random motion in the world. Because if anything, that's a sign of intelligence. Someone knows fractal geometry and imposes it on our experiences. Someone knows the calculus and imposes it on our experience. Therefore, idealism and science prove the existence of God. And I should point something out. Newton agreed with this. Newton was a profoundly pietistic person who actually, when he was finished with his mechanics, practiced alchemy. So then, what is the ultimate benefit of idealism? Well, for Berkeley, it's liberating. Berkeley is upset at the fact that ever since the Age of Reason, through the Enlightenment, particularly in the sort of lectures I've been offering, philosophers have been talking about extremely dry, abstruse metaphysical doctrines. They've been out there arguing about primary versus secondary qualities, final causality versus efficient causality, material entities versus minds, and formal mathematical proofs. And Berkeley's point is, does anybody really care about that? Is that what's important in life? Right? Is that why you picked up books to learn whether there were primary or secondary qualities? Is that what's really significant about philosophic conception? No. What he thinks is really important is the cultivation of virtue, the enjoyment of beauty, the experience of the sublime, and duty to God. Berkeley is the first of what we will find is a series of philosophers who proclaim the end of philosophy. He says, once you have idealism, you've solved every philosophical problem there is. Take your philosophy books now and burn them. Don't waste your time in these lectures. Go to church, where you will experience something vital for your life. What is more important than taking care of your everlasting soul? As he ends, I think quite poignantly, he says, for after all, what deserves the first place in our studies is the consideration of God and our duty, which to promote, as it was the main drift and design of my labors, so shall I esteem them altogether useless and ineffectual, if by what I have said I cannot inspire my readers with a pious sense of the presence of God. If you read this work, understand absolute idealism, and feel the presence of God in the creation of new ideas in your mind that you did not cause, pay off for Berkeley. He expects to find you in church on Sunday. And having shown the falseness or vanity of those barren speculations, and note, vanity and pride was for both More, Augustine, and all original sin. Having shown the falseness or vanity of those barren speculations, which make the chief employment of learned men, the better dispose them to reverence and embrace the salutary truths of the gospel, which to know and to practice is the highest perfection of human nature. And I want to argue that this is, as it were, the essence of the Romantic movement. They turn and say, yes, science is interesting and your logic chopping is fine, but who really cares? What's really important in life is virtue, is morality, is feeling connected, is having profound spiritual states, the experience of the beautiful and the sublime. That all of this science worship of the Enlightenment is stultifying. It's inane. That movement will really flower in the 19th century, but it could not exist if it did not have powerful precursors throughout the Enlightenment. And I think the first, in the English-speaking world and most profound, is Bishop Berkeley. I should point out, Berkeley is one of the few great English philosophers to grace our shores. He lived in Rhode Island for some time. We find a similar, therefore, doctrine in some ways in Jonathan Edwards, who's not an idealist, but is also a proto-romantic, I would urge. Berkeley had a profound influence on a fellow by the name of Samuel Johnson, not Dr. Samuel Johnson of England, but a certain congregational minister who became an Anglican in part from reading Berkeley, who then went on to found King's College, my alma mater, Columbia. And so we find that Berkeley, in fact, had a profound resonance on the Anglo-American world, even for those who ultimately rejected him and embraced the Enlightenment perspective. They could not help but be aware of that powerful critique that Berkeley had offered. Finally, I want to discuss Samuel Johnson's refutation of Berkeley. Right? Johnson said, now you know what Berkeley argued. Johnson said, how do you refute idealism? Thus. I kicked the podium. See, it's there. All right. Now, The reason I bring this up is because if you've understood Berkeley, you know that that's no refutation at all. Because Berkeley says, Sam, God's a regular guy. Every time you will to swing what you think is your foot, he's obviously going to put the idea of a pain in the toe. Right? No refutation of me at all. I preserve the world of sense. Okay. Is there a way in which Johnson's critique is powerful? Yeah, there is. Not at a philosophical level, but a commonsensical level. Does the average person really believe this is an idea? Or does the average person really believe that when you kick this, I kicked a piece of matter? So then the answer to these philosophic speculations, as we will see after Berkeley, a strain developing in Anglo-American thought is the move towards common sense. That in accord with Berkeley, they acknowledge, yes, philosophical speculation has reached a point of absurdity, of technicality, which divorces it from common sense notions. We can't lose that technicality, which Berkeley is far more technical than Locke. I think is far more sophisticated than Locke. But nonetheless, we should use it to preserve our common sense intuitions. And it's at that moment that I would argue Anglo-American philosophy, or English-speaking philosophy, moves from England to the Highlands, to Scotland. And from there, what I would call English Enlightenment or British Enlightenment moves to the phase of the Scottish Enlightenment, which I would argue is the height and culmination of Anglo-American empiricism. That, of course, is the subject of my next lecture.